So I thought I would just give the lay of the land about the book before he and I start talking, in case you're not familiar with what it's about. And I wanted to start by telling you a story. About 5 years ago, my son and I were standing at the window of our house in Cambridge, Massachusetts. There was a Greek Orthodox church across the street from us, and there were about 100 people walking up the street holding candles late one Friday night. And we were standing there startled by this. We'd never seen this before. Because we lived so close to the street, they stopped just right in front of us, so we had a perfect view. They had a chariot-like structure draped in fresh flowers, and inside I could even see a doll wrapped in white. And there was a priest in a traditional flat-topped hat and long robe. He carried a large book. He opened it, and he said a prayer to the congregation, and they responded. And they went back and forth for a while, and my son and I watched this community, this group of people of all ages, elderly all the way down to babies, out on a Friday night. The street had been closed down for this ritual. And after they finished, they walked down and into their church. They closed their wooden doors. And my son, who was 9 at the time, turned to me and said, "What was that?" And I said, "It must be Good Friday, and that's how they do it in the Greek Orthodox Church." And he said, "Well, why don't we do that?" And I said, "Because we're not Greek Orthodox." And he said, "Well, what are we?" And without thinking, I blurted out, "We're nothing." It was a terrible answer in hindsight. He didn't seem to mind. He just went to bed. But it was a crystallizing moment for me. It was a moment when I realized that my husband and I had never come up with an alternative worldview to provide our non-religious kids. When I was raised Christian, my husband was raised Jewish. Not wildly religiously, but enough that religion was a water we swam in. We knew the creeds, we knew the prayers. I knew the heft of a minister's sermon and the feeling of singing together in a sacred space. And watching that ritual outside our window, I could sense what was special about that, and that my kids had never had that experience. In fact, they had never been in a church or a synagogue. They had never read a Bible story. They had never sung a hymn. And so here we were raising these kids without religion. And what I wanted to know was if that was a bad thing. Maybe it was a good thing. I didn't know. I hadn't fully wrestled with it. It was something we just kept putting off. Because I work as a writer, the way I explore questions is by writing about them. And so I pitched this story to my editor at the magazine where I was working to write a story about raising kids without religion. And he said, "Great, because I just had a baby, and I'd like to know, what your findings are about this." And so I started writing this piece. I started doing some research. I thought it would be a reported personal essay, mainly about me, some friends, I'd interview some people. And about 2 weeks into the research, the Pew Foundation came out with this study. This was in 2012. Some of you may remember it. And it made all the headlines. They said that 20% of Americans describe themselves as religiously unaffiliated. So when they call and ask you, are you Baptist, are you Catholic, are you Jewish, how do you describe yourself? 20% check the box that says none of the above. And they call them the nuns, not Catholic nuns, but nuns as in none of the above. It's become kind of an umbrella term for atheists, agnostics, spiritual but not religious, people who really just don't care about religion one way or the other. This group of nuns, what was remarkable about that number, that 20%, was that for as long as people had studied religious affiliation, that number had been 7 or 8% in this country. And starting in about 1990, which is when I graduated from college, that number started going up. In fact, I interviewed Bob Putnam. I believe he's spoken here in the past, who wrote, of course, Bowling Alone, and then a great book about religion called American Grace. And he described it as a hockey stick. He says it's flat, 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 and then it just starts to go up. And I became really curious about why this was happening here, because most of the people who are nuns today were raised with religion. It's not that they were raised as atheists, it's that they walked away. They drifted from religion for whatever reason. And he and I talked about some of those reasons at that time. And I wanted to point out that those numbers have since gone up. Just yesterday, the Public Religion Research Institute came out with a new study that's called Exodus. And in this study, they show that now 25% of people describe themselves as religiously unaffiliated. And of that number, 39% of millennials describe themselves as religiously unaffiliated. When asked why are they leaving religion, they say they no longer believe the religious teachings, or they just didn't attach to religion, as they were growing up. So we see this change happening in our society, and I wrote about that for this magazine article as thoroughly as I could. And I went after the magazine article came out, and I gave a few talks, and I'll never forget one man who raised his hand at one of my talks, and he said, "Okay, I understand. A lot of us are leaving religion. I know I have, my wife has. But we have a son now, and I don't know where to go to find a values-based community. And I don't know what kind of rituals we should be doing as we bring him up in life. And we don't really know where is that space that we can go to escape the madness of our working lives, of his school and sports lives, where everything seems to be about achievement and pleasure, and so little about finding meaning and connection." And I realized in my article I hadn't answered that question. It's huge. So I set out on a 3-year project to find examples for this father, whose name I don't know, and I hope he's out there somewhere and has found his way to my book. And what I was trying to find, and what I came to call grace without God, ways in which people are creating these moments of connection, communities where they feel they are supported and they share values, and rituals that perhaps blend old and new, and in a way that in their modern lives aligns with what they actually believe. And I wanted to, before Steve and I sort of dive a little bit deeper into some of this material, just leave you with a short reading of an example of what I'm talking about. Because what I found after 3 years of traveling around the country is that there were a lot of people who were much further along on this path than I was that night with my son, that they had come up with words to describe their worldview. They had come up with practices that demonstrated what they valued to their children, and that there's this whole sort of grassroots movement happening out there all around the country, including in very religious, almost especially in very religious parts of the country, for people who are raising kids without religion. So let me just read this one short piece as an example, and then Steve and I can start our discussion. As fog lifted off the Pacific coast on an unseasonably cold Mother's Day, 16 families gathered under the rustic roof of the Green Dragon Temple at the Green Gulch Zen Center in Marin County, California. Incense filled the air, and ritual bells alerted the group that the ceremony, a culmination of 9 months of study by a group of teenagers, was about to begin. 16 girls and boys would pass from adolescence into adulthood before their mentors and families. Catherine Gouda was sitting beside me on the raised platform along one side of the room. As we waited for the official ceremony to begin, she told me she had been raised Catholic, but left and hasn't looked back. When she adopted her daughter, Lakba, from Nepal, she knew that she wanted her to be grounded in basic morality and to learn tools to quiet her mind and examine her experience in a non-judgmental way. She decided to let her daughter choose from different religious communities. So they went around searching for the right fit. At first, Lakba didn't like any of the groups they tried. Then Catherine found the Zen Center and started attending their public lectures there herself. She learned about the Coming of Age program and liked that it was a structured approach that focused on virtues but was free of religious dogma. Lakba had been sick that morning and wasn't sure she could make it, but her mother encouraged her to come. She wanted her to see the program through because she wanted to give her daughter something, as her own parents had given her her faith. Soon she'll be on her own, Catherine said. This is the last chance I have to do something like this for her. The ceremony began with the students walking in from the back of the room in 2 lines, one of girls and one of boys. They streamed past the large wooden Buddha set on a platform chair and came to sit on cushions in front. Though their hair was neatly combed, no one was formally dressed. They wore plain white shirts and dark pants. 4 mentors sat on the stage area facing them, and they took turns asking the teenagers to rise and tell the group one word that sums up what they stand for and one gift they will give to the world in their lifetime. When Lakba stood, her hands tucked into her light-colored, hooded sweatshirt, she coughed several times, cleared her throat, and said, "I stand for friendship, and my gift to the world is humor." Catherine then came to the front of the room and spoke about Lakba's struggles, comparing them to the recent Nepali earthquake and calling her daughter a mountain. "You came from the mountains, and you will become a mountain. Your feet are planted in the sweet earth. You have also experienced earthquakes." At this point, both mother and daughter began softly crying. Catherine closed by saying that despite all the difficulties, it has been her honor to be Lakba's mother. The mentors instructed Lakba to take her gifts into the world as she moves into adulthood and presented her with a card bearing her newly given name, Mountain Humor. How do we become who we are meant to be? This is a question religion has long engaged. But just because we lose religion, we don't have to lose the question or the rituals that help answer it. I wanted to present that also because it was an example of taking on an identity. In the beginning of the book, I talk about how my son had asked what we were, and I said nothing. And here is an example of a community coming together, basically a nature-based, secular coming-of-age program. And the name is coming from the underlying values, so that the identity is true to the person. And I thought that was a wonderful example of grace without God. So now I think Steve is going to join me, and we will continue our discussion. Thank you.
So Catherine, that was fantastic. I've known Catherine for probably 20 years. We have been friends over that time. And indeed, if she listened to me, I don't think this book would ever have come to exist, because when she told me she was writing a book and did I have any advice, my main advice was don't write a book. Never write a book. No one should write books. It's hard work writing books. And the advice I did give you, I think, was I said, just write it as if no one will ever read it, and enjoy the path along the way. And I think it's so clear when you read Catherine's book how much she enjoyed the path along the way. And I think almost every good book you read is defined by the fact that the person who wrote it really loved writing it. So I always find it interesting just to learn a little bit more about the person behind the book. So I want you to tell people just a little bit. So you had a really strange religious upbringing. Just a few minutes, can you tell us about how the different gyrations of religion that you were exposed to as you were a kid?
Definitely. Is this on?
Let's see. Yeah. I don't know. Here, you take it. I can't do it. You do it.
I don't think there's a button. How many Hyde Parkers does it take to turn on a microphone?
Don't worry about it. You can use mine.
Okay.
This one.
Ready? Yeah, this is good. Okay, great. Yes. Yeah, so I grew up in sort of a patchwork of Christian, different denominations, partly because my parents were divorced and we moved around a bit. So when I was with my dad, we were doing the Episcopalian church, and when I was with my mom, we were doing the Presbyterian church. And I also spent time in an all-girls Catholic school. So I had a lot of religion growing up. My family is all from Arkansas originally. My grandmother was deeply religious and raised my mother very religiously. In fact, my mother went to Bob Jones University for a while. That's pretty religious. But I think like a lot of Americans, the 60s and 70s, things started to loosen up. And so when my mother left small town Arkansas to move north with my father, my memory in between going to church was her doing yoga and meditation, and we couldn't let the phone ring when she was doing meditation. So I remember sort of the Eastern traditions starting to come in, but it was always this sense. If someone had asked me, "What are you?" I would have said, "I'm a Christian or a Protestant." There was this sense that you were this thing. But it was sort of a mix, like you say. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then it seems like for how many years, 10 or 15 years, you really didn't think about this very much.
Yeah, and again, this is a trend I uncovered as I was writing the book, that most people have a sort of a religious biography. Like there's sort of what's happening in the country, and then there's what's happening in each individual life. And very typically, people start out religious, they go away from it in college and when they're working in their 20s, and then they marry and have kids and they start to come back to it. And so I did that very traditional, like I'm in college, I'm not even thinking about that stuff. But what was different was for me and my husband, we never came back. And I think that's what the demographers are starting to see, is that for whatever reason, people aren't returning to the fold after they have kids. Yeah.
So let me now just shortly veer away from you. So you talk in the book, and you hinted at it in your comments, about what the valuable parts of religion are. So what do you see as the pieces of religion which give meaning? I think really meaning in the end is what you're looking for. So let's start with how formal religion gives meaning, and then let's move on from there to talk about how to get that meaning, what you've learned about how to get that meaning from others.
Yeah. So I think it comes from a lot of things. I think belief in God and belief that you're a part of a divine plan. And I should preface this by saying all nuns are not atheists, right? So there are a lot of people in this category who do believe in God. But if we're just talking in broad terms about religion, I think a belief in God gives you a really strong sense of meaning and purpose. But I also think a community can give you that, and connections to community. I tell a story in the book about my grandmother, and when her husband died in his 50s, she was driving home through the night back to Arkansas from Texas, and she was dreading going into that empty house. And as she pulled up, she saw that in the middle of the night, the lights were on, and there were people in the house, and there were people on her yard. And they were all her church community. They had been waiting for her. And I read that story. It was written up in a magazine, and I read it, and I thought, as I read it, who would come for us, and how long would they stay, and what kind of sacrifice would they make? So I think that being in a religious community you're highly motivated to think in terms that the sum is greater than, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, and that there is this sort of bowing down to the bigger picture and the bigger group, and not always just following your individual desires.
So community, but there's more. So you really focus a lot on rituals too. Can you talk a little bit about, because I think that, so as I read it, I think belief in God was one source of meaning. Community was a second source. And then rituals really was the third piece that you really emphasized. About how, the how-to of how to live a meaningful life without religion.
Yeah, so, and it's interesting because a lot of people who leave religion say, oh, those rituals, they're rote, or they're not serving. And I think it's a misreading of what rituals can do for people. And I thought the ritual that I observed, that I read tonight, is a great example of a ritual putting players on a stage to enact a kind of perfect world, and enact a kind of way we want to be with each other. A mother sharing her love for her daughter, a daughter sharing what's best about her with her community. And in that way, if we look at rituals like that, we can see that they can actually create this great expansion within us, in our lives, but really in relationship with other people.
So can you tell us, one of your first ritual attempts was Hanukkah. Can you tell us how it went when you started trying out some new rituals?
Yeah, so and a lot of I think people like secular families like mine kind of pick and choose, especially interfaith marriage is also on the upswing. And so you end up with a lot of families that do a little bit of both. So we've got, my husband is Jewish and I was raised Christian, so we kind of do everything in our own way. But one year, my husband was out of town and it was Hanukkah. And the kids who are, prompted this whole creation of this book and pretty much ask all their deep questions, really wanted to light the candles, but Michael wasn't there. And I can certainly light the candle, but they wanted to do the whole thing. They wanted to do the prayer, and they wanted to have a little ceremony. And they were little. Gosh, my son was probably 8 at the time, and our youngest was 2 and wasn't even really speaking. But I printed out the prayer, I got it off on the internet, where I get everything. And we had our usual pasta and chicken nuggets, and there was the menorah in the center of the table. And my son read the prayer. And he's a very earnest guy, and he was trying to read it with the right inflection, but he kind of sounded, it was almost like he was like speaking, I don't know, in Sanskrit or something. I don't know, it just wasn't quite the right accent. And he read it, and then everyone said, well, what does that mean? And I looked at them, and I didn't know what it meant. And I said, I'm sorry, Papa is not here. When he comes back, we'll ask him, but for right now, this is all you've got. I said, I know one Hebrew word, and I've said it before, and I'm not sure it's right for this moment, but let's raise our cups and say, L'chaim. And that was our word. And it really was this moment where I was sort of really moved by this whole thing that the kids had kind of gotten me to do, and they were asking me to pull out things that I didn't quite have, but we sort of made do. And it was it may sound silly, but it was this kind of a really special moment, and it made me realize that the kids want some rituals, and they don't have to be exactly like the ones you grew up with. For them, it's all new, right? So it's all being created. So to do something like that, to mark time, which went against sort of my lazy ways, was really important. And now we do much more of that now.
Yeah, that hits on my own upbringing. So I had a Lutheran mother and a Jewish father, neither of whom liked religion at all. But for some reason, we celebrated any holiday that involved presents for kids. So we did Christmas and Easter, Hanukkah, we do the Passover dinner, but none of the negatives, but like stuff like we'd never heard of Yom Kippur, or like we never gave up anything for Lent. And so in a weird way, my parents instilled in me very positive feelings about religion. It was always about getting the good things. So in that strange way, we had our own rituals. Have you built rituals? Can you tell people about some of the rituals you now have in your...
You know what's become our favorite ritual, and I think a lot of Americans share this, it's like our one national secular ritual is Thanksgiving. And one thing that we've done for years now is go around the table and say what we're grateful for. And it's bled into our everyday, so that now at night, when I tuck the kids in, they tell me one thing they're grateful for. And there's research on gratitude and how it creates a sense of compassion and altruism when we become more aware of all that we have. And so that was something that started really small and kind of took over and became a part of our everyday lives. One of the things I think religion gives people is these reminders to be thankful, to be a part of a whole, to atone for your sins, or to think about the coming year and what you want to do differently. And so for secular families like mine, I think it's important to build in some of those reminders, because otherwise I think it's too easy to get caught up in our busy lives, frankly.
Yeah, I just came back from Mumbai. I took my two 16-year-old daughters and we spent 3 days in the slum trying to work on a project I'm starting there. And it was interesting that my daughter, who actually by coincidence babysits for Katherine and Michael sometimes, I asked her what she took away from the trip, and you used the word gratitude, but she said the particular thing that stuck with her was in the slum by the side of the road there was a man who only had half of a body. I mean, I don't even understand how he was alive, but he had half a body. So he was only like this tall, and someone must have picked him up and set him down on a piece of cardboard, and they must come and pick him up at the end of the day or something and take him away. And as we rode by him and he saw us, he had this huge smile on his face. And my daughter Lily said, the thing I'll never forget about this trip is that guy had a smile on his face. And if he had a smile on his face, how can I not have gratitude for all I have? Which I thought was interesting, and it was, and I think in many ways, I've raised my children completely without religion, but like this trip to the slum was in some ways a kind of substitute for formal religion.
Right.
Now, why do you think, given all the good things that religion do, why do you think religion is in economic terms, losing so much market share so quickly over the last 20 years?
Well, there are surveys that they do, and they ask people, and the one that is just out yesterday, the number one reason, 60% of the people said they don't believe religious teachings anymore. Now, there's different ways to think about religious teachings. Does that mean the Bible? So they don't believe the Bible? I met with lots of people who had problems with the Bible. But maybe it's also that evangelical Christianity and the right wing have gotten so vocal in their beliefs that a lot of people think religion is too judgmental about gay and lesbian rights. That was another reason listed. Especially for millennials, this is a huge issue. They're a really open-minded group of people. They come from more diverse background. They're much more open to all of that, gay rights and women's rights and things like that. And when they see religious institutions, sticking to the tenets from the past, I think they don't know how they can fit there. And so there's been, some theories and now these surveys showing that people, when they hear the word Christian, it doesn't mean the same thing it used to be, right? It doesn't mean the teachings of Jesus. It now means I'm against gay rights, right? And so there's a way in which the brand name has been sort of polluted by more extreme parts of religion, and it breaks people's heart. I talked to a lot of religious people in my book, and I interviewed them, and an openly gay minister in New York who thinks religion is what we turn to. He said every funeral at Sandy Hook took place in a house of worship. And where do you go when things are that bad? Like, where do you turn to? And yet, he was losing congregants all the time, and he felt that people would only come to him when they really had this sort of extreme situation. So I think it's part of that. I think the name, the religious name, has been somewhat sullied. I also think there's so many choices now, and the internet opens people to a variety of belief systems and philosophies. And after 9/11, people got really interested in the writings of Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris. And so a lot of people I met with said, I read The God Delusion, and it captured so much of what I believed. And I finally found a voice for what I really believed instead of what I was pretending to believe. So I just think there's so much going on in our culture right now to explain some of that.
Okay, two more questions before I open it up to the audience. The first one is, so you have traveled far and wide looking at many different substitutes that have been created, organizations, ways of viewing the world that are trying to provide an alternative to, I'll call old-time religion. Right. So are there any of those, any of those that struck you as being especially good or appealing?
Yeah, so there was one, we were living in Cambridge when I was writing this book, and there's a humanist hub there that is very well organized. It's sort of further down the path than some of the other groups. They have something almost every night. They now have a secular Sunday school funded by E.O. Wilson. It's called the Big Question Lab. And they've got a waiting list because so many kids want to go of all ages, up to teenagers. And every week they talk about big questions. And there's a big science focus, but there's also, they're going to read Harry Potter as a sacred text. And they're going to talk about how to be a good neighbor. And when we were there, this was before this whole thing had started, we did a lot of community service activities so I could bring the kids. One thing that you miss when you leave religion is opportunities to join with others to do community service type work. And so they had that for people. They have a Sunday service. So I thought that was pretty good. And then there were a number of others. I went to Oregon and met with a storytelling community that meets quarterly in a synagogue of all places because it's the biggest place in town. And people get up on stage and they tell a story based around a theme. And the idea of the guy who organizes it, who happens to be a minister, though this is a secular group, is to get people to give testimony to their lives and have others bear witness and create a sense of compassion so that when you see this person on the street, you kind of have a little bit of an understanding of their story. He says, we don't know our neighbors anymore, and so he's trying to combat that. So what I found again and again was these people with these really creative ideas trying to address that exact problem.
Okay, so this has been a pretty intellectual conversation, but many of you are probably here and are looking for the how-to, right? So you have kids, and you're here because you want to know the 5 things you should do starting tomorrow to make sure that you have happy, wonderful, well-adjusted, successful kids. So what are your 3 or 4 tips or advice do you give to people?
Well, I should point out that the book has an entire resources section. So for anyone who's looking for book suggestions, and there are books arranged by age for kids, but also books for adults. The most important thing I found was connection, and that religion is really good at getting people to connect with each other. And in fact, the research shows that people who go to church but sit in the back and don't actually talk to anybody get much less satisfaction out of their religious experience. It's really all the community. And so we talk a lot about that in our neighborhood, and we have found it in our neighborhood. And I just have one example of a way in which we try to get our kids to connect to something larger than themselves. That seems to be the key. You can do it in nature. A lot of people find that there, but also in community service. So I'm part of a neighborhood club in our neighborhood, and there was recently a fundraising basketball game that I signed my son up for, and the night before he was supposed to play in it, his coach from his travel team called and said, "We need you. We're going on the road, and it was a big game, and you got to be there." And he was livid and said, "I have to go to that game." And I said, "No, you don't. You have to go to the fundraiser because you committed to that, and it's important because it helps to raise money for people in our community that need it." And so he went grudgingly, and his team won, and they gave him all a basketball. And it was a really small thing that we made him do that. But I felt like if more people could do this, we might make a better world. As we were leaving, he said, "I have this basketball, but I want to give it to the neighborhood club because I don't need it." And so there was just this little kind of thing that you might get in religion of, let me think about someone other than myself. And I think it just takes constant awareness and work and reflection.
And I can attest that Katherine and Michael have wonderful children.
No.
So whatever they're doing is working really, really well. So why don't we first, let me just thank Katherine for